Hello, glad to see you on the channel. Subscribe, give a like, and don't forget to leave a comment. Enjoy watching.
They said I was overqualified for the clinic. I told my wife that night, already folding my last office sweater into the cardboard box HR gave me. I smiled, wished her luck, and left her my patient notes. Then I opened a beer, turned off my work phone, and felt lighter than I had in years. The full conversation had gone something like this. Tessa Reagan, the new director, young, sharp suit, LinkedIn smile like she practiced it in the mirror every morning, sat across from me with a printed script in her hand, as if I couldn't tell this was rehearsed. Mark, this isn't personal, she said, which we all know is corporate speak for I'm about to make it very personal. You're a highly experienced professional and honestly, a bit overqualified for this clinic's evolving vision. We're restructuring, and unfortunately, your role has been deemed redundant. Redundant. 14 years. 14 years of managing everything from suicidal walk-ins to Medicaid audits, and now I was redundant. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice or ask for a second chance. I just looked her in the eye, she avoided mine, and said, "Got it. Hope it all works out." Then I stood, shook her limp hand, and said, "Be sure to read the notes I left. They'll help." They never read the notes. Not really. The notes weren't some passive-aggressive jab or a booby trap. I'm not that petty, but they weren't a user's manual either. They were the truth. And the truth at our clinic was messy. We served a community that didn't have the luxury of waiting. Half of our patients couldn't afford meds, the other half couldn't afford time off to even show up. You had to be sharp. You had to remember that Mr. Dean in room 4 always lied about taking his insulin and that Mrs. Alegria would shut down if you used her son's name in front of her husband. The system didn't track that stuff. I did. So yes, I had notes. Pages and pages of them, updated weekly. I left them printed and in the shared drive. If she wanted to know how to interpret lab flags from the mobile unit, it was in there. If she wanted to understand why we booked Dr. Patel with the walk-ins and not the elderly follow-ups, it was there too. But she had to look. I knew she wouldn't. The staff saw me packing up the next morning, quiet and clean, just like I'd kept my corner of the clinic. A few of them offered hugs. Sarah from reception actually cried, which hit me harder than I expected, and Nurse Letty handed me a sealed envelope with a drawing from her kid. Said I reminded her son of his grandpa. I didn't say much, but when I walked out the door that final time, I knew exactly what was going to happen. And I wasn't angry. Not then. Not yet. I'd seen this before. Someone new gets brought in to modernize or streamline the operation, and they can't read the soul of the place, just the spreadsheets. Then it all starts unraveling, and they scramble, too proud to ask for help, too young to know what they don't know. By the time I got home, I'd already started seeing the messages. Staff were confused. Tessa had held a team meeting and said I'd moved on and that the transition would be seamless. Seamless? She didn't even know which login unlocked the patient callback system. I had tagged those lists in the EMR, and without the right filters, she wouldn't see the psych referrals, including the flagged ones. The ones who called crying at 2 a.m. The ones who said things like, "I'm not going to make it to Monday." But hey, I was overqualified, right? I spent the next week doing nothing for the first time in over a decade. I took long walks with the dog. I watched old movies during the day. I ate breakfast slowly. I even sat down with my daughter and actually helped her with college applications without one eye on my work email. And every single day, I thought about that clinic and how it was probably already cracking at the seams. But I didn't check in. I didn't call. I didn't even drive by. Let the pieces fall where they may. The first call came the following Friday. I didn't recognize the number, but I knew the voice the second she spoke. "Hi, Mark. This is Tessa. I was hoping you had a moment." I didn't say anything for a full beat. I just let the silence sit there like a brick between us. Then I said, "Everything you need is in the notes." "Well, yes," she said, too quickly. "But I'm having trouble locating the callback queue. There's a few things that don't seem to be syncing properly." I smiled, but not the friendly kind. "It's all there." "Breadcrumbs," I said, "if you know how to follow them." Then I hung up. She called again 2 days later. Straight to voicemail. Now, let me be clear. I didn't sabotage anything. I didn't lock her out of files or delete anything critical. I didn't change passwords or plant viruses. I'm not a villain. I just stopped carrying it all. I stopped compensating for everyone else's laziness and assumptions. I stopped cleaning up messes before they started. And that, apparently, was enough to make the whole damn place start leaking at the seams. So here's my question for you. What would you do if your boss stabbed you in the back, then called you for help with the knife still sticking out? The second time she called, it was 6:42 a.m. on a Monday, and I was halfway through making pancakes, real ones, not the frozen discs we used to nuke on clinic days. My phone buzzed on the counter with a number I already knew by heart. Tessa Reagan. I let it ring twice, then picked up out of pure curiosity, not kindness. Mark, sorry to bother you this early, she said, and I could hear the cracks forming in her voice already, like stress fractures in a windshield. I just had a quick question about the intake system, the, modified intake system you mentioned in your. It's all in the notes, Tessa, I said, calmly pouring batter into the pan, the hiss of it hitting the skillet like punctuation. Breadcrumbs. Yes, I saw that, but it's not working like I thought. The site queue isn't populating correctly, and some of the patient flags are missing. I think something's been erased or overwritten because now a few of the regulars are showing blank notes in. They're not blank, I interrupted. You're just looking at the surface level. The critical flags are stored in the legacy filter under custom tags. If you didn't activate the filter set, it's not going to show anything important. You have to actually click through it. She paused, long enough that I imagined her scribbling the words down like a freshman who skipped the lecture. Okay, custom tags. Got it. Thanks. Also, just one more thing. How do I find the backup contact sheet for the referral specialists? The one nurse Letty used. I laughed quietly, not bitterly, but in that way a man laughs when he's watching someone try to use a hammer as a screwdriver. It's paper, I said. Filed by hand. Top left drawer of the file cabinet labeled Old World Magic in the nurse's station. Unless you threw it out already. She didn't respond. The line clicked off after a rushed thank you, and I didn't hear from her again for the rest of that week. But I heard about her. The first real sign of unraveling came when Sarah from reception texted me 3 days later. Nothing dramatic, just a quiet, hey, do you remember how to reset the automated reminders? They're stuck in Spanish for every patient this week, and nobody knows how you linked it to the language preferences. I didn't reply. Not to her. Not to anyone. Not even when Letty called to say Tessa had tried to cancel a standing appointment for a psych evaluation without realizing it was a court-mandated check-in. The patient, a Vietnam vet named Harold who had 3 previous suicide attempts, showed up anyway and waited an hour before leaving in silence. 2 days later, his sister called, asking why no one had returned his messages. I didn't reply to that either. Look, I know how that sounds. Like I was punishing the clinic just to make a point. But I wasn't out for revenge, not then. I was done. Done trying to save everyone from decisions they didn't ask my opinion on in the first place. I had played janitor, therapist, IT help desk, and social worker for over a decade, and in the end, all that got me was a patronizing pink slip and a new boss who didn't even have the common sense to ask questions before she started ripping out the wiring. The truth is, I left the place functional. Not easy, but functional. There were traps, yes, but only if you ignored what was already in front of you. I'd spent years building systems that worked not because they were modern, but because they fit the reality we were in. Tessa didn't want to adapt to reality. She wanted to impose a vision. And visions don't pick up the phone at midnight when a teenage girl calls saying she swallowed pills. Visions don't remember to hold a patient's hand when you have to tell them they can't afford the surgery they need. Visions sure as hell don't read the miscellaneous notes tab I added to every patient's file, where I wrote things like only eats when his dog eats, or won't speak if you wear scrubs that are blue. What she didn't understand, what she never understood, was that every clinic has a heartbeat, and it's not in the manuals or the charts or the boardroom memos. It's in the quiet, unrecorded things people like me carry in our heads and in our guts. And once you fire that person, you better be ready to learn the hard way. By the second week, the phones were ringing off the hook, literally. Patients were calling, confused why their appointments had been canceled or moved without notice. Pharmacies were faxing the wrong prescription requests because someone had turned off the auto-confirmation settings I'd set up years ago. The intake nurse had a meltdown when a new EMR update wiped her entire queue. I heard from a friend that Tessa stayed in the clinic after hours that Friday, relogging patient information manually. They still hadn't found the referral spreadsheet. That one wasn't in any drawer. It was tucked inside a locked Google Drive folder labeled Waffles, which I'd shared with the previous director and no one else. Because when you've worked a job long enough, you stop trusting the systems to hold up under pressure. You make your own. I watched all of this from my living room, sipping coffee, watching squirrels outside the window, wondering how long it would take before someone realized that overqualified just meant holding the place together without making a fuss about it. And you know the most ironic part? I would have helped her. I would have sat down over lunch and explained every line of that damn system if she'd treated me like a human being and not a broken cog in a machine she didn't understand. But she didn't. She smiled that tight, corporate smile, handed me my walking papers, and said, "We'll take it from here." Well, now she was taking it, one panicked voicemail at a time. So I leave you with this. What's the real cost of firing the person who knows where all the landmines are buried, and then ignoring their last warning? The third week after I left the clinic, a strange calm settled over me, not peace exactly, but that slow exhale your body does when it's no longer waiting for the next crisis to land in your lap. I wasn't checking emails anymore, wasn't answering calls from numbers I didn't recognize, and I certainly wasn't playing tech support for a system I no longer owned. But that didn't mean I wasn't watching. People talk, especially in tight-knit offices that pretend they aren't gossip mills. And what I started hearing confirmed exactly what I knew would happen from the moment I shook Tessa's hand goodbye. They were unraveling. See, there's a funny thing about working somewhere for 14 years. You become the invisible glue. You fix the leaky pipe under the break room sink without a work order. You reset the blood pressure cuff that always glitches on Wednesday mornings. And you memorize the difference between urgent and urgent when a nurse says it out loud. But more than that, you learn to listen for the things people don't say. The silences. The hesitation in a patient's voice when they ask if their test came back normal, even though they don't quite know what that word means. You log it all, mentally at first, then physically, because after a while you start to realize no one else is going to. And that's where the call logs came in. I started keeping my own call log back in 2013 after a teenager named Liana walked into our clinic one rainy afternoon and asked to talk to someone before she did something dumb. We didn't have a psychiatrist on site that day. And the on-call social worker was already 2 counties away dealing with another crisis. We handled it, eventually, but I realized in that moment that waiting for someone else to keep track of the close calls wasn't going to cut it anymore. So I made a document. Simple at first. Date, time, patient initials, reason for the call, follow-up needed. I kept it updated every day, no exceptions, because the clinic system, like most, was too slow, too clunky, and too damn optimistic about human behavior. It didn't record the voice tremors. It didn't flag the calls that felt wrong. But I did. When I left, I made sure that log was printed, labeled, and placed in the transition file folder I handed over with a smile. The digital copy? Buried 2 folders deep in a shared drive under a name that would mean nothing to anyone not paying attention. Old business, final recs, Halperin. Not hidden. Not encrypted. Just invisible to someone who thought they already knew everything. And apparently, Tessa didn't even glance at it. Because 3 weeks after I left, a call came into the clinic from a woman named Deirdre, a regular patient, mid-60s, early stages of dementia. Sweet woman, easily confused. She'd been flagged in my system as a soft red, which meant she needed a follow-up call within 24 hours of any unusual behavior. That call never happened. She wandered into the emergency room 2 days later dehydrated, disoriented, and terrified. Her daughter, who had trusted us because of a decade's worth of quiet, consistent care, called the clinic demanding answers. She didn't get them. So she did what people do when they feel ignored. She wrote an email. It didn't come to me, of course, but it got forwarded through the grapevine until it landed in the inbox of a nurse I used to eat lunch with every Thursday. She sent it to me with one line. "Thought you should see this." It was worse than I expected. The daughter had written, in careful, angry words, how the clinic had failed her mother, how the staff seemed disorganized, how no one followed up, how a simple wellness call could have prevented the hospitalization. She didn't threaten to sue, not yet, but she CC'd the county board. That's when I knew the clock had started ticking. And that's when I knew Tessa would try to pin it on me. Sure enough, another call came in. This time from an unknown number, voicemail only. Her voice was tight, rehearsed, the kind of tone someone uses when they've been coached by HR. She said they were conducting a legacy data audit, which is just a fancy way of saying we're checking to see if we can blame you for this. She asked if I could confirm whether certain call logs had been properly transitioned. Said she was concerned that some follow-up notes might have been misfiled. I didn't call her back. Instead, I opened my cloud drive, the one I hadn't touched since leaving, and I clicked on the archive folder labeled Clinical Liability Personal Backup. Inside was everything. Every flag patient. Every escalation note. Every follow-up email I'd sent to the former director, the social worker, even Tessa during her onboarding. There was a paper trail so thick you could use it as insulation. I didn't delete it. I didn't weaponize it. I just shared it quietly with one person. Dr. Leslie Harmon, our former medical director, now semi-retired but still on the clinic's advisory board. She was one of the few people I trusted to read it with the seriousness it deserved. She didn't respond right away. But the next day, a notice went out from the board. Due to recent concerns about record management during administrative transition, we are initiating a formal review. And just like that, the game changed. Because now it wasn't about whether I had failed to warn them, it was about whether they had failed to listen. And the evidence was overwhelming. So here's what I want to ask you. When the house burns down, who's really to blame? The one who handed you the fire extinguisher, or the one who left it in the closet and lit a match anyway? The thing about trying to rewrite a story that someone else already lived through is that, sooner or later, the paper trail catches up with you. You can polish your version for the boardroom and sugarcoat it for HR, but if the guy you pushed out of the building left behind a meticulously kept archive, every polite lie starts to rot under daylight. And by the fourth week after I was fired, restructured, that rot was finally seeping into the walls. I didn't know how deep the panic had set in until I got a call from Sandra, who'd been in billing for as long as I'd been running the clinic. She wasn't the gossiping type, which is why I picked up. No small talk, no how are the kids, she just said, they're trying to blame you for the Deirdre thing, and then fell silent while I processed that little gem of news. Blame me. For a patient who called after I left. For follow-ups missed by the new leadership. For protocols I literally documented in 2 formats, digital and hard copy, with footnotes. That patient had been on the flagged watch list, the same list I'd explained in person during the knowledge transfer meeting Tessa had cut short because she had a yoga class. Now they were combing through the EMR like digital archaeologists, trying to find evidence that I hadn't done my job. What they found instead was a hall of mirrors they couldn't navigate. See, when you work under multiple administrations, survive 3 EHR transitions, and still manage to keep the clinic functioning, you learn a few tricks, like how to blind CC yourself on key emails, how to forward critical threads to your private inbox for future training reference, and how to summarize every major policy change in a neutral tone so it can be used later, if need be, to explain why something failed. Not if. Why? Because it's never really an if in places like that, just a matter of when. I didn't intend for it to be used like a shield, but that's what it became. I compiled the most relevant emails into a single PDF, 28 pages of, hey, just flagging this, and per my last message, and attached is the patient list for urgent callbacks, all written in the precise, careful language of a man who saw the train coming and said so in writing. I didn't send it to Tessa. I didn't even send it to HR. I sent it to Leslie Harmon again, this time with a note. You said transparency mattered. 2 days later, Tessa's name disappeared from the staff directory. There was no grand announcement, no carefully worded goodbye email with bullet points and gratitude. Just silence. Her office door reportedly stayed closed for an entire morning, then opened to reveal a half-packed box and an assistant quietly rolling up a whiteboard filled with sticky notes and jargon. One of the nurses told me later she looked dazed, like someone who just realized the fire wasn't an accident, and the smoke alarm had been working, she just never bothered to listen to it. Now, before you think I took pleasure in that moment, let me clarify something. I didn't hate Tessa. I hated what she represented. She was another in a long line of administrators who thought process could replace people, who saw experience as an obstacle instead of an asset, who believed that if something wasn't in a manual, it didn't matter. She didn't fire me out of malice. She fired me because I didn't fit into her version of the future. And to her, that was enough. But what she didn't grasp, what so many like her never do, is that futures built without foundations don't hold. They sink. They collapse under the weight of their own assumptions. And when that happens, someone always has to answer for it. I heard from Letty that HR was trying to spin it as a mutual separation, the usual dance of dignity. Apparently, they floated the idea that my documentation had been incomplete and lacking in procedural consistency. But then the board got a copy of the same PDF I sent to Leslie. That changed the tone quickly. One of the board members, an old friend of mine from back when we both worked intake on Saturdays, sent me a one-line email that read, "Your receipts saved more than your reputation." That stuck with me. Because it wasn't just about my name being cleared. It was about proving something bigger. That the quiet work matters. That logging the small stuff, the thankless details, The offhand conversations with patients who just need a minute. That stuff is what keeps a clinic alive. Not dashboards. Not efficiency reports. Not quarterly projections. The fallout wasn't dramatic. No lawsuits, no shouting matches in the break room. Just a shift in atmosphere. Like a spell being broken. I heard the staff started quietly pulling up my old templates, reactivating the filter systems, even printing out my miscellaneous notes archived to keep at their desks. Someone even found the referral spreadsheet in the Waffles folder, shook their head, and said, "Damn, he really thought of everything." No, I didn't think of everything. I just paid attention. And when I left behind the map, not to be clever, not to be vindictive, but because I knew they'd need it. I just didn't expect them to ignore it so thoroughly. So here's the truth they'll never say out loud. They didn't need to replace me. They needed to understand me. And when they couldn't or wouldn't, they turned me into a scapegoat. But scapegoats don't usually have paper trails. I did. And now, every decision they made since my exit was being reviewed in the light of those emails, those logs, those quiet little breadcrumbs they thought were irrelevant. So let me ask you something straight. If someone handed you the blueprints to a house before walking away, and you still managed to burn it down, whose fault is that? Really? 3 months after I walked out of that clinic for the last time, I stood in the corner of a borrowed office at a free community center just south of town, watching an elderly man struggle to explain why his new insulin wasn't working the way it used to. He didn't have a chart, no insurance data, and no assigned provider. Just a pill bottle, a scrawled note from a disinterested urgent care visit, and 2 different glucose readings that made no sense side by side. I sat down, took my time, and asked him to start from the beginning, not because I had to, but because nobody else had. That's what I do now, most mornings, a few hours at a time, in a quiet building where nobody talks about metrics, nobody checks a dashboard before asking how a patient is doing, and nobody schedules a meeting to discuss things we already know how to fix. I don't make much, enough to cover gas and coffee, and for the first time in years, I sleep through the night without dreaming of unanswered phones or printer jams or nurses crying in the hallway after a patient collapsed in triage. It's not revenge. It's recovery. But of course, the clinic didn't fade quietly into the background. Places like that never do. They limp. They stagger. And then they try to rebrand. After Tessa resigned or was pushed, depending on who's telling the story, they brought in a temporary consultant from a management firm that specializes in crisis stabilization, which is a fancy way of saying they're the cleanup crew after leadership sets the place on fire. This new guy, Dennis something, didn't bother reaching out to me, which was wise. But I got word from Letty that he'd been asking questions. Not about me, specifically, at least not at first, but about previous workflows and legacy protocols, and why some patients were showing up twice a week with no documentation on file. Then, a few weeks later, my name came up in a board meeting, or so I'm told. One of the board members apparently asked why none of the issues that had emerged under Tessa had been caught during the transition. Someone mentioned my documentation. Another mentioned that I'd left abruptly, which made me laugh out loud when Letty told me. Abruptly? I gave 14 years, one of which I spent living in a hotel after my house flooded, and I still never missed a week of work. I trained 3 directors before her. I reorganized the entire patient intake system during the flu surge of 2017, and I handed them their future in a labeled binder. Abruptly. Sure. What happened next wasn't a grand finale or a headline-worthy takedown. It was slower than that. Softer. A series of events that, if you weren't paying attention, you might chalk up to coincidence. But I was paying attention. First, the county pulled a grant, not fully, but enough to hurt. Then a local reporter started sniffing around after a tip was sent about the mishandled psych follow-ups. I didn't send it, for the record, but I know who did. And finally, a patient filed a formal complaint citing emotional negligence, which isn't a legal term but sounded damning enough when printed in the local paper beneath the clinic's logo. The fallout was quiet. Tessa's name didn't come up again. The board restructured, HR changed vendors, and the clinic stopped using the intake system I'd built, not because it didn't work, but because it reminded them of the way things had been before everything went sideways. And yet, every now and then, someone would dig up an old report or find one of my hand-typed flowcharts in a drawer and remember how things used to function. Not perfectly, but humanely. I ran into Sarah at a coffee shop last week, and we talked for a while. She told me they'd hired a new admin, older guy, someone who asked a lot of questions and didn't pretend to know everything. I told her that was a good sign. She laughed and said, He reminds me of you. Less grumpy, though. I took the hit with a smile and paid for her coffee. Before we said goodbye, she leaned in and asked something that stuck with me since. Do you think she ever meant to hurt anyone? I didn't answer right away because it's not a simple question. I think Tessa believed she was fixing things. I think she genuinely thought she was the adult in the room, brought in to drag us out of the dark ages. But in trying to rebuild something, she missed the part where people already lived inside that house. She kicked out the support beams and was surprised when the roof fell in. So no, I don't think she meant harm. But that doesn't mean she didn't cause it. And then there's the thing I haven't told anyone, not Sarah, not Letty, not even my wife. Something I found out a week after Tessa left the clinic. It came from one of the psych nurses, someone I barely knew but who remembered I'd flagged a handful of patients as high risk. He called to ask if I still had access to my old files, said there was one patient in particular he couldn't find notes on, a young woman who'd called in twice during the week I left, both times after hours. She never got a follow-up. You didn't need to say her name. I remembered her immediately. She used to leave voicemails that rambled, soft, scared, apologetic. I'd flagged her for immediate callbacks and written her down on the whiteboard every Monday so nobody would forget. When I checked the archive, her name was still there, right where I left it, under the heading, critical call back within 24 hours. She never got that call. And as far as I know, she never called again. So here's where I leave you, not with vengeance, not with triumph, but with a simple truth I've come to accept. When people say they're overhauling a system, what they really mean is they're wiping the slate clean. But in clinics, in hospitals, in the fragile places where people bring their wounds and expect us to care, there's no such thing as a clean slate. There are only stories we choose to carry forward or ones we let vanish in silence. I walked away with my dignity intact, my conscience a little bruised but whole. But every now and then, I think about the ones who fell through the cracks after I left, and I wonder how many could have been saved with just one more callback, one more flagged note, one more moment of listening. She never once called the psych patients back. Not once.